She wasn't imagining anything. There was a man watching her, and he had lived 30 feet away. She was 19 years old. She had just married the man she loved. She had dreams, a flower shop of her own one day, a family, a home filled with the ordinary warmth of a life just beginning. And for months before she died, she told the people closest to her that something was wrong. She said it clearly, and she said it more than once. She was being watched. She was frightened. She needed someone to believe her. Nobody did. That single fact, that the people who loved Lindy Sue Biechler most looked her in the eye and told her she was imagining things, is what makes this story impossible to forget and impossible to set aside, because she was not imagining anything. There was a man watching her. He knew her schedule. He knew when she came home alone. He had lived just 30 feet away and had learned everything he needed to know from the inside. And on a cold December night in 1975, he stopped watching and walked through her door. It took 48 years, a science that didn't exist when Lindy died, the painstaking work of genetic genealogists, and a discarded paper cup in an airport bin to finally deliver the justice she deserved. This is her story, and it deserves to be told and heard in full. Lindy Sue Little was born on the 31st of January, 1956, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a small, close-knit city in the heart of Amish country, where neighbors knew each other's names and doors were often left unlocked. Her parents separated when she was young, and Lindy was raised by her mother. Her father remarried and had a son named Mike, nearly a decade younger than Lindy. Despite the age gap, those two were inseparable. Mike would later describe his older half-sister in 3 words: loyal, free-spirited, and a hard worker. Her husband Philip saw something else in her, too, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Philip met Lindy through her stepsister, whose husband worked with him. He had gone along one afternoon to help paint their apartment. Lindy was there. Years later, he would say, "I was pleased and surprised that a pretty girl like Lindy found me interesting and wanted to get to know me." That is not the sentence of a man telling a casual story about how he met someone. That is a man who still could not quite believe his luck, even decades on. They married in October 1974. Lindy was just 18. Philip worked at a Hertz car rental branch while studying at Millersville State College. Lindy had a part-time job at a flower shop, but that was only the beginning. She wanted to open her own shop one day. She encouraged Philip to finish his degree and become an art teacher. She wanted children. She had an entire future mapped out in her mind, and Philip stood at the center of it. In 1974, they moved into their first home together, Unit 14A at Spring Manor Apartments, a small 4-unit building on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. First floor, fresh start. A young couple with everything ahead of them. But almost immediately after moving in, something changed in Lindy. It did not begin as a vague unease. It was not the ordinary nervousness of settling somewhere new. From the very start, Lindy's fear was specific, persistent, and entirely directed. She felt as though someone in or around that building was watching her. She felt it in the hallways. She felt it in the car park when she walked to her car in the evenings. She felt it in the stillness of the apartment on the nights Philip was still at work and the building had gone quiet around her. She told her friends. She told her family. She said plainly and repeatedly that something was wrong, that someone was watching her, that she was frightened. And everyone told her the same thing: you've just moved. You're adjusting. You're a new wife in a new place. You're overthinking it. They were wrong. She wasn't imagining anything. There was a man watching her, and he had lived 30 feet away. Then one evening, it stopped being a feeling. Lindy was home alone. Philip was on his late shift when she glanced up toward the front door. Through the small glass pane set into the door, 2 eyes were staring back at her, unblinking, still, just watching. The moment Lindy's eyes met his, he was gone. No footsteps, no sound. Just a smear on the glass and the silence of an empty hallway. The man had been close enough to touch her door, close enough to see the layout of her apartment, close enough to see she was alone. After that night, Lindy refused to be home alone after dark. But Philip's schedule had not changed. Winter was coming. The days were growing shorter, and most evenings, Lindy still came home to an empty apartment, locking the door behind her, sitting in the quiet, waiting. There was another evening, at her brother Mike's house. Lindy and Philip were visiting, everyone relaxed downstairs, when a mirror fell from a wall on the floor above them and shattered. In any other home on any other night, that is a 5-second story. You check, you find nothing, you move on. But Lindy's entire body went rigid. She grabbed Philip and told him to check every room, every wardrobe, every corner of that house before anyone moved. Mike watched his sister in that moment and saw something he had not expected. This was not nerves. This was not a woman being overdramatic. Her mind had reached a place where even the sound of glass breaking in an empty room meant someone was already inside. That is what months of living in genuine, unvalidated fear does to a person. It rewires the way you process everything around you. Your mind stops asking what if and starts answering he's here. And still, nobody connected the dots. Nobody sat down and asked the one question that might have changed everything. Who exactly is watching her and why? Instead, they called it stress. They called it anxiety. They called it the sort of thing young women sometimes feel when life changes too quickly. They did not ask her to describe the man at the door more carefully. They did not suggest she speak with the police. They were wrong, and she was running out of time. Lindy finished her shift at the flower shop while it was still light outside. She had errands to run, nothing unusual, nothing that felt like a last afternoon. She picked up Philip's paycheck from the Hertz branch, stopped at the bank, did the grocery shopping in Millersville, $46 worth, enough bags that she would need 2 trips from the car. She pulled into the Spring Manor car park at around 7:15 in the evening. It was already dark, cold. She gathered the first load of bags, walked to Unit 14A, set the groceries on the kitchen table, and walked back out to the car for the second load. That walk lasted perhaps 90 seconds, long enough to leave the door unlocked, long enough for someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment to slip inside. Lindy's Aunt Celeste and her Uncle Merle were on their way to a basketball game that evening. Their child was playing, but they made a small decision. They would stop by Lindy's first. She should not be home alone on a Friday night. They pulled up at 8:46 p.m. Merle stayed in the car. Celeste walked to Unit 14A. The front door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The first thing she saw was the lamp on the floor, knocked over, the sort of thing that does not fall on its own. Celeste stepped inside and called Lindy's name. Silence. The apartment was quiet in a way that did not feel like quiet. It felt like something had already happened and the air was still holding it. Then she saw the signs of a struggle all the way from the front door to the entryway. And then she found her niece. Lindy was on the kitchen floor. The groceries she had carried in on her first trip were still on the table above her. Ordinary things, vegetables, everyday items she had bought less than 2 hours earlier, sitting just 18 inches above where she lay. Celeste ran. When police arrived and walked through that door, the lead officer would later say that in years on the force, he had seen things most people never encounter. What was inside Unit 14A that night was different. This was not a crime that had escalated by chance. This was deliberate, concentrated, and purposeful. The medical examiner's report confirmed the brutality of the attack. Lindy had been stabbed 19 times. She had suffered injuries across her body that showed she had tried to flee and that her attacker had followed her. 2 knives had been used. A butcher knife from her own kitchen, the handle wrapped in a cloth to avoid leaving fingerprints, and a smaller 4-inch blade the attacker had brought with him. That second knife was never found. He took it when he left. Lindy had fought. The defensive wounds on her hands told investigators she did not surrender. She fought back with everything she had. A retired FBI consultant who later reviewed the case offered a difficult observation. The killer likely delivered a disabling blow early, And what followed was not a struggle for survival, but something else entirely. A level of rage, he said, that almost always signals something personal. Someone who did not merely want her dead, someone who wanted her destroyed. There had been no forced entry, no broken window, no kicked-in door. Whoever walked into that apartment either had a key or had walked through the door Lindy had left unlocked for 90 seconds while she went back to the car. Outside, a witness reported seeing a dark-colored car parked near the building with its headlights on and engine running, as though it had been waiting for a signal. By the time police went looking, the space was empty. Philip was at work when the call came. He arrived at the complex and detectives stopped him before he could go inside. He was 22 years old. He had been married for barely a year. He stood in the same car park where Lindy had pulled in just hours earlier, bags in her arms, and tried to understand what was being said to him. Lindy's father, Wayne, received the news elsewhere. The grief hit him so suddenly and so violently that police physically had to hold him back. A father restrained by strangers in a car park, while somewhere inside that building, his daughter was still on the kitchen floor. On the day Lindy was buried, a reporter asked the police chief where the investigation stood. He said, honestly, "We actually don't have a thing at this time." And yet, pressed into the fabric of Lindy's clothing, invisible to the eye, the killer had left something behind. A biological signature so small it fit inside an evidence bag, something that would wait quietly for science to catch up. In 1975, there was no way to read it, so it waited. In the weeks after the murder, police interviewed over 300 people. Every lead was followed. Every suspect was cleared one by one. And then, less than a year after Lindy was buried, her killer did something extraordinary. He came back. On the 26th of December, 1976, just over a year after the murder, Lindy's family drove to Bowman's United Methodist Church in Pequea Township to visit her grave. Her headstone had been drenched in red paint, not splashed carelessly, soaked. And beneath the paint, deep scratches had been gouged into the stone. The kind you only make if you press hard and stay long enough to mean every single one. Every other grave in that cemetery was untouched, just hers. 9 days later, on the 5th of January, 1977, an envelope arrived at the Manor Township Police Department. On the outside, in capital letters, "Urgent." Chief Donald Shaler opened it and found 2 handwritten pages, different handwriting on each. He read the first page, then read it again. "Hi, Shaler. Just eats up your heart knowing you haven't caught me yet. Still around." The letter was rambling, disturbing, and unlike anything investigators had seen before. The writer described the grave, said the paint color reminded him of Lindy covered in blood, said the scratches represented the number of times she had been stabbed. He asked the police chief to print the letter in the newspaper. He claimed to be a well-educated man, single, living in the West End of Lancaster. He said he had been under the influence of amphetamines that night. He asked genuinely, or so it read, for a priest. He asked whether God could forgive him. The second page was signed by someone calling herself Janice Crum, supposedly a friend of the killer's, writing while he slept, claiming he had confessed everything to her and would turn himself in if the letter was published. Police found a real woman with that name in Lancaster County. She had no connection to the case. The FBI brought in forensic linguist James Fitzgerald, who specialized in the analysis of writing patterns. His conclusion was striking. Both pages had been written by the same person. The capitalization, the underlining, specific spelling choices, they matched in ways no forger would think to replicate. And then he said something that pointed investigators in an unexpected direction. The second page, he noted, was written from the perspective of a calm observer, a structural pattern more common in women's writing. And in 1975, very few men would describe themselves in writing as fat and beautiful. But police already knew the killer was male. A bloody footprint had confirmed that. So Fitzgerald's reading suggested something else. The letter had not been written alone. There was a second person, someone who knew what had happened, someone protecting him or present with him or both. That possibility was never resolved. It remains open today. Then came the failure that still stings, decades later. The original letter, the only direct window into the killer's psychology that investigators had ever held in their hands, was lost by the evidence lab. Not destroyed deliberately. Lost. No fingerprints had been lifted from it. No handwriting preserved for future analysis. The system had been handed a gift, and it lost it. The years that followed became a cycle of efforts, each one falling just short. In 1982, a Florida serial killer was investigated and ruled out. In 1984, the district attorney paid $2,000 for the services of two psychics. The descriptions they provided were so vague as to be useless. In 1989, an attempt to extract DNA from a dried blood sample failed because the sample had deteriorated too far. In 1992, a new detective team took over. Still nothing moved. Meanwhile, Lindy's parents were getting older. Her father Wayne died in the summer of 2000. Her mother Eleanor followed in early 2007. For 30 years, they had lived in the same county as the man who killed their daughter. They passed strangers on the street, sat in church pews, looked at faces. They died without ever knowing which set of eyes had been the last ones their daughter saw. They spent 30 years looking. They died in the dark. One person refused to accept that this was how Lindy's story ended. Mike Little had spent his entire adult life watching this case go nowhere. He was a U.S. Navy officer, disciplined, methodical, the kind of man who does not accept "we tried" as a final answer. Lindy was his older half-sister. She had been 19 when she was killed. He had been watching the system fail her, quietly and consistently, for 3 decades. In December 2007, he arranged for a billboard on Route 30 near Route 283, one of the busiest stretches of highway in Lancaster County. On it, 2 photographs: Lindy and a 25-year-old schoolteacher named Christy Murrah, who had been raped and murdered in her own home in December 1992. Her brother Vince had connected with Mike through their shared grief. Above the photographs, in large letters, a question: "Do you know who murdered us?" The billboard was supposed to stay up for 30 days. The advertising agency kept it for 10 extra days at no charge. Local news covered both cases again. No new leads came in. Mike filed it as one more step taken. One more thing tried. He was a Navy officer. He understood that impossible was just a word people used before they found another way. And quietly, without headlines, without fanfare, science had already begun catching up. Back in 1997, forensic scientists had managed to extract a male DNA profile from the biological evidence preserved on Lindy's clothing. After 22 years, technology had finally advanced enough to read what the killer had left behind the night he walked out of that apartment. In 2000, that profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database in the United States. The system searched and returned nothing. Whoever had killed Lindy had never been convicted of a crime requiring a DNA sample. The profile sat there, unmatched, for another 18 years. Then, in June 2018, a different case in Lancaster County was solved, and it changed the direction of everything. Raymond Rowe, a 49-year-old disc jockey who performed locally under the name DJ Freeze, was arrested for the rape and murder of Christy Murrah, the same young woman whose photograph Mike had placed alongside Lindy's on that billboard 11 years earlier. The tool that caught Rowe was genetic genealogy, a method that does not require a killer to already be in a criminal database. Instead, it works by finding distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, who have voluntarily shared their DNA with ancestry websites. Researchers then build family trees outward, branch by branch, eliminating candidates until a likely match is identified. DNA had reached 26 years into the past and pulled out a killer who believed he had been invisible. Philip Biechler, now living quietly in Millersville, he had remarried, rebuilt a life of sorts. saw the news about Christy Murrah's case being solved, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time: hope. If Christy could get justice after 26 years, why not Lindy after 43? He made calls. He pushed. And in 2018, the Lancaster County District Attorney commissioned Paraben Nanolabs, a genetic research firm based in Virginia, to take a fresh look at the DNA evidence from Lindy's case. Paraben began with something called DNA phenotyping. Human DNA doesn't only tell you who a person is, it also contains information about what they look like: skin tone, eye color, hair color, the broad structure of a face. By studying the genetic markers in the killer's sample, scientists could build a visual estimate of the man who had stood in Lindy's apartment in 1975. On the 5th of September, 2019, 44 years after the murder, investigators released 2 composite images to the public. One showed what the killer likely looked like at age 25, around the time of Lindy's death. The second showed an age-progressed version, what he might look like in 2019, around 65 years old. For 44 years he had been faceless. Now for the first time he had a jawline, eyes, a face. Tips came in. Everyone led to a dead end, but Paraben was not finished. In December 2020, the DA's office asked them to go further: a full genetic genealogy analysis. The killer's DNA was uploaded to public ancestry databases, the kind used by ordinary people tracing their family histories. He wasn't in any of those databases, but his distant cousins might be. His third cousins, people who had no idea they shared bloodlines with a murderer. The DNA told researchers something early. The killer's ancestry traced to a small village called Gasparina in the Calabria region of southern Italy. That narrowed the search considerably to approximately 23 people in Lancaster County with that specific Italian heritage who would have been adults in 1975. Then the team began eliminating: wrong age, wrong sex, wrong location. The circle got smaller. In December 2021, after more than a year of painstaking genealogical research, Paraben gave detectives a name: David Sinopoli. Police pulled his records. No criminal history, never once connected to the Biechler investigation across 46 years of inquiry. But there was one detail that made every detective in that room go very still. In 1974 and 1975, the year before and the year Lindy was murdered, David Sinopoli had lived at Spring Manor Apartments, the same 4-unit building, the same address. He had moved out just months before the murder. He had not been a stranger. He had been a neighbor. He had known exactly when Philip worked late. He had known which evenings the car park was quiet. He had been 30 feet away, learning everything he needed to know. They had his name. They had 46 years of evidence pointing toward him. But they needed fresh DNA, undeniable, current, the kind that would hold up in a court of law. And they could not simply ask him for it. On the morning of the 11th of February, 2022, David Sinopoli walked into Philadelphia International Airport with his wife and another couple. They were heading away on a trip. Detectives were already there. They had been watching him for weeks. Sinopoli ordered a coffee. He drank it. When he was finished, he dropped the cup into a rubbish bin and walked toward his gate without a second thought. The moment he was out of sight, a detective walked to that bin, reached in, and retrieved the cup. It went into an evidence bag. That bag went to a specialist DNA laboratory. And what came back was not a lead, not a clue, not a promising avenue to explore. It was a confirmation, 46 years in the making. The result was later expressed as a statistical probability: 1 in 10 trillion. The entire population of Earth is roughly 8 billion people. 1 in 10 trillion means you could test every single human being alive and still not find another match. It was him. The biological evidence found on Lindy's clothing in 1975. All of it. The same man. On the morning of the 17th of July, 2022, Lancaster County detectives drove to a home in East Hempfield Township. David Sinopoli answered the door. He was 68 years old, retired from a local printing company, where former colleagues would later describe him as quiet, unremarkable, the sort of man who never made you look twice. He had been married for 36 years. He had 3 children. 9 grandchildren who called him grandfather, sat at his table for holidays, had no idea, according to his own attorney, what their grandfather had done. For 46 years, he had lived less than 5 miles from the apartment where he had committed this crime. He had never left Lancaster. He had stayed, built a family, grown old, attended family gatherings, and said nothing to anyone. He was arrested without incident. The time between Lindy's murder and his arrest was later calculated precisely: 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days. He pleaded not guilty in October 2022. Then, on the 19th of October 2023, David Sinopoli walked into a Lancaster County courtroom and changed his plea. The room was full. Lindy's family sat on one side, Sinopoli's family on the other. A large photograph of Lindy Sue Biechler, 19 years old, newly married, full of plans, was placed on an easel beside the defendant's table. Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson stood and faced that photograph. "These cases are never forgotten," she said. "Lindy Sue will never be forgotten. While the defendant was able to carry on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him." She turned to Sinopoli. "Look at her. Look at the precious life you stole in 1975. Sinopoli glanced at the photograph. Without reaction, Philip Biechler stood and spoke. He was in his 70s now. The young man who had gone to help paint an apartment one afternoon met a girl named Lindy and felt he could not quite believe his luck. That young man had lived an entire life in the shadow of the night. He received that phone call. He told the courtroom that after Lindy died, he had made a decision. He would not enter another relationship for a very long time. The outcome of that decision, he said, had been a very lonely existence. There had been alcohol and there had been drugs to quiet what could not be quieted any other way. He had eventually remarried and rebuilt something like a life, but he had never stopped carrying December the 5th, 1975. He looked directly at Sinopoli. "You took a huge part of my life from me and caused an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering for so many people. While others had to live with the terrible consequences of what you did, you got to live your life. And then, with a steadiness that took some courage to deliver in that room. While I forgive you, because my God tells me to, you need to pay for your actions." Judge David Ashworth addressed Sinopoli directly. "You chose to viciously stab Lindy Sue Biechler 19 times and then defile her to satisfy your own selfish desires. The enormity of the damage you have caused is incomprehensible." And then the judge said something that cut through every legal formality in the room. "Make no mistake, you are not standing here because you developed a pain of conscience. You did not come forward to give this family closure. I have seen nothing in your conduct or your words to suggest that you are truly remorseful for what you have done." David Sinopoli was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. Given his age, it is effectively a life sentence. When given the chance to speak, he offered 9 words. "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." No explanation, no motive, no answer to the question Philip had asked him directly. Why? The motive that investigators identified decades ago and sealed inside a case file. It stayed sealed. Some things, it seems, the system keeps even after it delivers justice. She was 19 years old. She had just moved into her first home with the man she had married. She had a future planned out in careful, hopeful detail: a flower shop, a family, a life. For months before she died, she told the people who loved her most that something was wrong, that she was being watched, that she was frightened. She said it clearly and more than once, and everyone told her she was imagining it. She was not. The man who had been watching her had lived 30 feet away. He had built his knowledge of her routine from the inside. He had moved out a few months before the murder but never moved far. He stayed in the same county for 46 years, raised a family, grew old, and said nothing to anyone. It took science that didn't exist in 1975. It took a genetic map traced back to a small village in the south of Italy. It took a detective standing at an airport rubbish bin, reaching into the unremarkable clutter of a Tuesday morning, retrieving a paper cup that a 68-year-old man had thrown away without a thought. It took all of that to prove what Lindy had known since almost the day she moved in. She told everyone she was being watched. She was right. It took 48 years for the world to believe her. There is something important in that, beyond the legal outcome, beyond the sentence delivered in a Lancaster courtroom in 2023. There is a question it puts to all of us, to anyone who has ever dismissed a woman's fear as nerves, as sensitivity, as overthinking. Lindy's instincts were not faulty. Her read of the situation was completely accurate. The people around her, the people who loved her, defaulted to reassurance over attention. They told her what they hoped was true rather than taking seriously what she was saying. And it cost her everything. Lindy's mother and father both died before justice was served. Her father Wayne in 2000, her mother Eleanor in 2007. For 30 years, they had lived in the same county as the man who killed their daughter. They died in the dark. Her half-brother Mike, the U.S. Navy officer who put up the billboard, who kept pushing, who filed every failure as one more step on a road that had to end somewhere. He was still alive when Sinopoli was arrested. He got to see it. Philip, who had forgiven because his faith asked him to, and who had still built an entire life carrying December the 5th alongside him. Philip got to stand in that courtroom and look Sinopoli in the eye. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 years old. She deserved to open her flower shop. She deserved to see Philip finish his degree. She deserved to have children who would have called her mum. None of that happened. But at least, at last, the world finally believed her. Lindy Sue Biechler, January 31, 1956, December 5, 1975, she was right. She was always right.